The unification of Egypt around 2950 BC marked the birth of the world's first nation-state. Today, this political and social structure seems almost inevitable. Our economic status, rights, responsibilities, and freedoms are all closely tied to the countries to which we belong. Except for Antarctica, every part of the Earth's surface falls within the borders of one of over 200 countries. But this has not always been the case. Prior to the late 4th millennium BC, states as we know them did not exist. Instead, people identified with their families, local communities, or regional affiliations. The idea of a nation-state was an innovation pioneered by the ancient Egyptians. Starting with Narmer, Egypt's early monarchs governed a completely new type of political entity. This posed a significant challenge: to create a sense of unity among a population scattered from the first cataract of the Nile to the Mediterranean coast. The emergence of a distinct Egyptian identity stands as one of the greatest accomplishments of Egypt's founding rulers. Behind this effort lay a strong element of self-interest. The concept of divine kingship shaped Egypt's civilization, giving rise to its iconic structures like the pyramids, and influencing the construction of monumental tombs and temples that still survive. The prominence of monarchy in ancient Egyptian culture is reflected in the way we classify its 3,000-year-long history, from Narmer's rule to the death of Cleopatra. Unlike other civilizations that are categorized by technological milestones like the Stone or Bronze Ages, Egyptian history is organized by dynastic rule. Fittingly for such a deeply traditional society, this system remains largely the same as the one developed by Manetho, a priest and historian who lived over 2 millennia ago. Using temple records, Manetho divided Egypt's rulers into 30 dynasties, beginning with Menes, identified today as Narmer, the founder of the first dynasty around 2950 BC, and ending with Nectanebo II, the last king of the 30th dynasty. To provide a complete historical picture, modern scholars have added a 31st dynasty to include the Persian rulers who briefly took control of Egypt before Alexander the Great's conquest. The Macedonian and Ptolemaic dynasties, established by Alexander and his general Ptolemy, are not part of Manetho's original framework. Though these later dynasties were of foreign origin and marked a departure from traditional pharaonic rule, they still underscore the ongoing role of dynastic monarchy in Egyptian political life. In line with ancient Egyptian ideology, Manetho's dynastic history presents a continuous line of rulers tracing back to the time of the gods and, ultimately, to the moment of creation. This narrative reflected the official doctrine upheld by the pharaonic court, that the creator god Adam had established the pattern for kingship at the beginning of time, and each subsequent king was a legitimate successor in a divinely ordained tradition. In practice, however, the situation was more complex. During periods of political fragmentation, multiple individuals could claim royal authority in different regions of Egypt. For instance, Manetho's 22nd, 23rd, and 24th dynasties are now understood to have overlapped to some extent. Modern research has also shown that some of Manetho's dynasties, like the 7th, were likely based on misinterpretations of temple records and may not have existed at all. Similarly, the 9th and 10th dynasties probably represent one single ruling family rather than two separate ones. Despite these inconsistencies, Manetho's classification system has remained remarkably resilient. Its continued use today to structure the study of ancient Egypt highlights how central the institution of monarchy was to both his understanding of pharaonic civilization. Kingship, as a system of governance, was fundamentally Egyptian in nature. Among the earliest civilizations, Egypt stood out as the only one to adopt monarchic rule from the outset of its history. In contrast, Mesopotamia was composed of city-states that drew their identity from local temples. There, political and economic authority primarily resided with the high priests. It wasn't until later that a system of monarchy emerged in Mesopotamia, and even then, it never attained the same level of centralization or absolute power seen in Egypt. In the Nile Valley, kings appear to have exercised authority over the people from as far back as prehistoric times. Archaeological digs at the ancient royal cemetery of Abydos have revealed graves dating to around 3800 BC. One of these graves contained a ceramic beaker painted with what may be the earliest known image of a king. The scene depicts a tall figure wearing a feathered headdress, holding a mace in one hand and a rope restraining 3 captives in the other. The portrayal of subdued enemies and the recognizable combination of mace and feathered crown clearly indicate a royal identity, even though the individual likely governed only a small region. Evidence suggests that kingship was simultaneously emerging in other parts of Upper Egypt. A pottery fragment from Nut featuring a crown, along with a grand complex of columned halls near Nekhen, supports this idea of multiple early centers of royal power. By around 3500 BC, the symbolic imagery of kingship had reached a mature form, most notably in a burial site at Nekhen known as the Painted Tomb. The interior of this tomb was adorned with a plastered and painted mural illustrating a royal figure engaged in various ceremonial activities. The most prominent feature is a grand procession of boats, yet in one corner, the king is shown striking down 3 bound prisoners. This striking motif, first seen on the Abydos beaker, became the defining symbol of Egyptian kingship. It reappears on the famous Narmer palette and continues to be featured in temple reliefs throughout the entire span of pharaonic history. The visual language of early kingship in Egypt was not only powerful but also remarkably persistent. As Egypt transitioned into a unified state, the artistic representation of royal power evolved rapidly, reflecting the shifting concept of kingship. This transformation can be traced through a series of ceremonial artifacts and commemorative carvings. One particularly noteworthy example is the so-called battlefield palette, an artifact similar in form to the more famous Narmer palette but dating to an earlier period. While the Narmer palette highlights the king as a human figure, the older palette portrays the ruler as a massive lion, trampling and impaling his defeated enemies across the battlefield. The purpose was clear: to present the king not merely as a man, but as an overwhelming, natural force. A similar theme appears in a contemporary carving at Gebel Sheikh Suleiman, near the Second Cataract of the Nile in Nubia. This inscription depicts the victorious Egyptian monarch as a giant scorpion, clutching a rope in its pincers that binds a vanquished Nubian leader. From Narmer's own era, an ivory cylinder portrays the king as a ferocious Nile catfish, striking rows of captives with a large club. The symbolism across these examples sends a unified message. Egypt's earliest kings sought to elevate themselves above their people by embracing a godlike persona. This trend reaches its peak with the Narmer palette. Its shape evokes a time when semi-nomadic cattle herders carried their possessions and used their bodies for ritual adornment. In such a society, face paint held significant ritual meaning, and palettes were cherished items. By Narmer's reign, however, the cosmetic palette had been repurposed into a symbolic tool for declaring the king's supreme authority and divine nature. The Narmer palette's design reflects a fusion of 2 worlds. The shallow recess once used to grind cosmetics is now framed by the elongated necks of 2 fantastical animals, known as serpopards. These beings, held on leashes by attendants, do not originate from Egyptian tradition. Instead, they belong to the artistic vocabulary of ancient Mesopotamia. Their presence on an Egyptian artifact highlights a period of vibrant cultural exchange between the Nile and the distant Tigris-Euphrates region. In their efforts to assert dominance and legitimacy, Egypt's early rulers borrowed and adapted foreign symbols. These borrowed elements served their purpose, but once Egyptian culture had developed its own visual language of power, most of these foreign motifs were set aside. The only notable exception was the Mesopotamian-inspired architectural style adopted for royal palaces and administrative buildings. The Narmer palette captures this turning point in Egypt's cultural journey. It marks the moment when Egyptian civilization, having absorbed outside influences, began to define and express its own unique identity. The contrast between prehistoric and historic forms of expression is evident in the portrayal of Narmer himself. On one side of the Narmer palette, he is depicted as a powerful bull, demolishing the walls of an enemy fortress and crushing his foes beneath his hooves. When the palette is turned over, this animalistic imagery fades into the background. Instead, the king appears in human form, triumphant and commanding. While the ideology behind royal power remained consistent, its visual representation underwent a dramatic shift. Depicting the king as a beast was no longer fitting. His newly sanctified status required a more refined and elevated portrayal. Throughout history, monarchs have used ornate symbols to distinguish themselves from ordinary people. Royal regalia often serves as a visual shorthand for the multifaceted concept of kingship. In Christian kingdoms, for instance, a crown topped with a cross signifies the monarch's subordination to divine authority, while a scepter embodies strength balanced with justice. Ancient Egypt used regalia in much the same way, and many of its symbolic items trace back to prehistoric times. The earliest known emblem of authority in Egypt is a simple wooden staff, dating to around 4400 BC. Discovered in a grave at El Omari near modern-day Cairo, the staff was buried beside its owner. This basic instrument of control, a literal big stick, remained a lasting marker of high office in ancient Egyptian culture. However, as the institution of kingship evolved, so too did its symbols. That basic staff gave way to the scepter. One notable example is an ivory scepter shaped like a shepherd's crook, found in a royal tomb at Abydos. This crook became so closely tied to kingship that it was adopted as the hieroglyph representing ruler. When paired with the flail, or goad, it symbolized the dual role of the monarch, to guide and discipline his people. These symbols reflect Egypt's early pastoral society, in which the man who controlled the livestock held authority over the community. This legacy is echoed in another early symbol of kingship. It signified the king's embodiment of the bull's raw strength and dominance, providing a subconscious link to Egypt's pre-dynastic heritage. A crown, of course, is the most iconic symbol of monarchy. Rulers throughout the ages have worn distinctive headgear, not only to set themselves apart but also to elevate themselves above the people. The concept of the crown and even the nation-state may have originated in ancient Egypt. Reflecting their binary worldview, Egyptian kings wore two distinct crowns to represent the two regions of their realm. From the beginning of recorded history, the red crown symbolized Lower Egypt. It featured a short, squared base with a tall rear projection, fronted by a curled extension that resembled an insect's proboscis. The white crown of Upper Egypt, on the other hand, was tall, conical, and ended in a bulbous tip. This division suited Egypt's fondness for dualistic symbolism, but in truth, both crowns likely originated in Upper Egypt. Archaeological evidence suggests that the red crown came from Nut, while the white one emerged further south, near Nekhen. After Egypt was unified, it made political and symbolic sense to assign the red crown to the north, keeping the white one for the south. The Egyptians were masters at constructing traditions to serve national identity. By the middle of the first dynasty, the royal image makers combined the two into a single double crown, representing the king's authority over both lands. From that point forward, Egyptian monarchs had three crown types at their disposal, each suited to highlight different aspects of their power. While art could project royal authority in symbolic form, architecture amplified that message on a grand scale. Like many autocratic rulers throughout history, Egyptian kings were drawn to monumental construction as a way to showcase their might. From the birth of the Egyptian state, the monarchy skillfully used architecture to convey ideology. A specific architectural style was chosen to represent kingship visually. This design, creating dramatic patterns of light and shadow in Egypt's intense sunlight, was originally developed in Mesopotamia during the mid-4th millennium BC. Just as with other cultural borrowings during the state's formative period, this palace facade style found favor with Egypt's early rulers. It had a foreign allure and a commanding presence. As a result, it was quickly adopted for royal buildings, including the palace in Memphis, the new capital and administrative center. This whitewashed palace, known as the White Wall, must have been a dazzling spectacle. Other palaces across Egypt were modeled on the White Wall, transforming this once foreign motif into a signature of Egyptian royal identity. Throughout the history of the pharaohs, both iconography and architecture played vital roles in communicating the ideal image of kingship to the Egyptian populace. These tools were particularly effective in a society where up to 95% of the population was unable to read or write. However, in the ancient world, the most significant threats to royal authority rarely came from the general public. Instead, the individuals a king needed to secure loyalty from were those in his inner circle. This small, literate elite held positions of power within the administration and were uniquely placed to challenge the reigning monarch. That said, these officials typically owed their positions, privileges, and prosperity to royal favor, and thus had a strong incentive to support the monarchy. Nevertheless, Egypt's masterful state propagandists developed a sophisticated strategy to solidify the king's authority among the educated class. Rather than relying on imagery alone, they turned to the written word. Initially, hieroglyphic writing emerged in the late prehistoric period to serve practical functions such as record-keeping and managing resources across Egypt's expansive territory. Yet it wasn't long before the symbolic and ideological power of writing was recognized. The Narmer palette offers an early example. Hieroglyphs are used to name the central figures as well as to describe the depicted events. Language, then, became a powerful means of defining kingship through the use of royal titles. While in today's Western societies most titles have lost their traditional authority, certain designations still echo older systems of deference and hierarchy. In ancient Egypt, by contrast, titles and names carried immense weight. The development of the royal titulary, or formal system of royal titles, was a deliberate and potent expression of the king's divine status. The oldest of these titles, predating even Narmer, was the Horus name. It linked the king directly to the falcon god Horus, the supreme sky deity, thereby portraying the monarch as a living embodiment of divinity on earth. This was a bold, unambiguous assertion. To question the king was to challenge divine order itself. This message permeated all aspects of royal symbolism. Official seals and inscriptions displayed the falcon god perched atop a rectangular frame enclosing the king's Horus name. This frame represented the palace gate, reinforcing the idea that the king, operating within his royal domain, did so under divine authority. A second title emerged during the reign of Narmer's successor, further refining the ideological presentation of the monarch. Written using the hieroglyphs of a vulture and a cobra, it emphasized the divine protection granted to the king. Nekhbet, the vulture goddess, was associated with the city of Nekheb in Upper Egypt, while Wadjet, the cobra goddess, represented the town of Dep in the Nile Delta. By appointing these two ancient deities as joint guardians of the crown, Egypt's rulers ingeniously wove local religious traditions into a cohesive national theology centered on the person of the king. This strategy extended beyond titles. The use of the red and white crowns to symbolize the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt was part of the same ideological project. So too was the elevation of Neith, a Delta goddess, in royal naming conventions. Narmer's wife, for instance, bore the name Neithhotep, meaning Neith is satisfied. In this way, the major religious centers from the northern marshlands to the southern Nile Valley were absorbed into the ideology of kingship. The third royal title, introduced alongside the double crown, further expanded the concept of kingship. Known as Nisibidi, it was composed of two symbols, a reed and a bee. Though their origins are not entirely clear, their combined meaning was rich and multifaceted. This title expressed the king's role as the unifier of opposites. He governed both Upper and Lower Egypt, the fertile lands and the deserts, the domains of the living and the dead. Additionally, the Nisibidi title embodied the core duality at the heart of Egyptian monarchy. It reminded those around the king that he was not only a political leader, but also a divine figure on earth. This fusion of spiritual authority with political power made the king's position virtually unassailable. Throughout history, rulers have naturally understood the unifying power of ceremony and spectacle. Public rituals have always had the ability to generate loyalty and support among the population. The ancient Egyptians mastered these displays from an early stage in their civilization. A richly adorned stone mace head, discovered alongside the Narmer palette at the city of Nekhen, depicts an early ruler known to us as Scorpion performing a symbolic irrigation ritual. In the scene, the king uses a hoe to open a canal, while a subordinate kneels nearby, holding a basket to collect the displaced earth. The presence of fan-bearers, standard-bearers, and female dancers underscores the ceremonial significance of the event. This vivid depiction from Egypt's formative period illustrates how royal rituals were used to highlight the king's role as a bringer of fertility and order. Another mace head from the same archaeological find presents a different, though equally powerful, royal ceremony. This time, King Narmer is shown seated on an elevated platform beneath a canopy, adorned with the red crown and holding a scepter. Flanking him are his usual attendants. Behind them stand guards armed with large staffs, a reminder that even divine kingship required protection. The ceremony appears to focus on military triumph. Spoils of war and captured enemies are paraded before the throne. Nearby, within a walled enclosure, 3 captured antelopes are shown. This ideological parallel between war and the hunt, between the chaos of nature and political rebellion, would continue to resonate throughout Egypt's history. Recent archaeological interpretations of the ancient site at Nekhen offer intriguing new perspectives on early kingship. What had long been identified as a temple dedicated to the falcon god Horus may, in fact, have served a different function, a ceremonial arena for royal rituals. According to this view, the central mound within the enclosed space could have been a raised platform from which the king made formal appearances. The open space before the platform may have been the setting for public ceremonies, such as prisoner parades. If this theory holds, the scene depicted on Narmer's mace head could be an artistic representation of an actual royal event. Additional artifacts from Nekhen suggest that these objects marked and identified ceremonial royal grounds. Extending this interpretation across Egypt, other structures previously labeled as shrines may also have functioned as hubs of royal ritual. In early dynastic records, the king and his actions dominate art and text, with traditional deities playing only secondary roles. This raises a provocative possibility. In the earliest phases of Egyptian civilization, the kings were regarded as gods themselves. Monarchy wasn't just a feature of religion. This merging of divine kingship and ritual continued to shape pharaonic culture for millennia, but it came with a grim undertone. Looking again at the Narmer and Scorpion mace heads, the objects themselves reveal something fundamental about Egyptian royal authority. Since prehistoric times, the mace has symbolized power, likely because it is an unmistakable weapon of force. The choice to associate maces with kingship speaks volumes about the underlying nature of Egyptian rule. The scenes carved on the Narmer palette further reveal the brutality at the heart of royal power. On one side, Narmer is shown wielding a mace, about to strike down an enemy. On the reverse, the king is depicted surveying the aftermath of his victory, rows of headless corpses, each mutilated in a deeply degrading way. The victims' severed heads and genitals are placed between their legs. Disturbing though it is, this imagery suggests that such treatment of defeated foes was not exceptional in Narmer's Egypt. At the highest tier of Egyptian society, the king personified a relentless and unforgiving authority. Although he was often portrayed as the divine unifier of the land, a godlike figure who upheld cosmic order, royal imagery left no doubt that preserving this order involved ruthlessly destroying those who threatened it. Narmer and the kings who came before him had seized control through force, and they made no secret of their readiness to use violence to maintain it. The monarchy's visual propaganda was intentionally aggressive. It served both as a pledge of protection and a stark warning. One of the most disturbing images from early Egyptian art appears on the top section of the Scorpion mace head. This band of decoration features a series of royal standards, each representing a different facet of the king's power. However, these standards double as gallows. In hieroglyphs, the lapwings symbolize the ordinary populace, known in ancient Egyptian as rikit, in contrast to the elite class that held real influence. On this mace head, the common people are literally shown being executed under the emblem of royal rule. This theme would reappear in later periods. For instance, the base of a statue of King Nedjeriket, or Djoser, is adorned with carved bows and lapwings, suggesting that the king symbolically crushed both his foes and his own subjects underfoot. While many Egyptologists have recoiled at the symbolism of such imagery, its implications are undeniable. Absolute power is often maintained through coercion, and ancient Egypt was no exception. Perhaps the most chilling reflection of this harsh rule is found in the burial practices of Egypt's earliest monarchs. At Nut, an elite tomb dating to around 3500 BC contained more than lavish grave goods. Scattered around the chamber were human leg bones, and in its center, a collection of skulls. These remains belonged to individuals who had clearly been dismembered and buried with the tomb's owner. At Nekhen, several pre-dynastic burials show signs of scalping and decapitation, while at Adima, 2 bodies were found with their throats cut before beheading. One archaeologist initially suggested these might represent early cases of ritual self-sacrifice, where loyal retainers chose death to follow their master into the afterlife. However, burials from the First Dynasty at Abydos present a more unsettling reality. Royal tombs from this era included rows of subsidiary graves belonging to members of the king's court. In one example, every individual was young. Another tomb, from the end of the dynasty, featured a single roof covering both the king's burial chamber and the surrounding servants' graves. Such uniformity in death makes it impossible to believe these were natural deaths or voluntary suicides. Though once thought to be self-sacrifice driven by loyalty, more recent studies have shown that many of the bodies exhibit signs of strangulation. The conclusion is both grim and undeniable. Egypt's earliest rulers wielded absolute control over life and death, and they exercised that power to reinforce their dominance. For the average person, life meant subservience. For those within the king's inner circle, it meant living under constant threat. Neither path offered much comfort. The practice of retainer sacrifice reached its height relatively early in Egypt's history. The tomb of Djur, the third pharaoh of the First Dynasty around 2900 BC, was encircled by 318 subsidiary graves. It appears that, having secured absolute authority, Egypt's rulers were eager to exercise it fully. Those laid to rest alongside the king included not only human attendants but also his pets. That both dogs and concubines were considered fitting companions in death reveals much about the perceived worth of royal servants at the early Egyptian court. Following the reigns of Djur and his successor Jet, the custom of sacrificing retainers began to wane, and came to a complete halt by the close of the First Dynasty. However, one might question whether this shift was driven more by practicality than by changing moral views. Eliminating an entire group of trained servants at the end of each king's reign was a significant loss of skilled individuals. Evidence of human sacrifice also appears on labels from royal tombs. These small tags, once attached to containers of offerings, are etched with scenes of royal events. 2 such labels, seemingly linked to the same ritual, depict a bound man kneeling beside a large basin. Another figure stands over him, gripping a long knife, clearly poised to deliver a fatal blow. Though no inscriptions accompany the images, the purpose of this scene is unmistakable: the ceremonial killing of a human captive, most likely as part of a ritual connected to kingship. The royal tomb, through its contents, and the attendants buried nearby, was meant to ensure that the king could continue performing his ceremonial role for eternity. It became the cornerstone of kingship, and from the dawn of ancient Egypt to the end of the Pharaonic era, each reign's most significant building endeavor. Preparing the king's burial demanded immense resources. It's often said that Egyptians undertook this task willingly, seeing it as their contribution to a covenant that secured the nation's well-being and survival. But this interpretation, unsurprisingly, originates from the monarchy itself. Promoting the idea that the king embodied unity and national prosperity served his own agenda. In truth, the king's motivations were largely self-serving. The royal necropolis at Abydos, where the ruler's tomb was surrounded by those of his followers, physically reflected the structure of Egyptian society. The development and enforcement of this ideology played a pivotal role in shaping pharaonic civilization, but it came at a heavy cost. With Egypt's unification, the steady advance of centralized state control had begun in full force. Ideology alone is never sufficient to secure lasting power. For a regime to maintain authority over time, it must also exert substantial economic control to support its claims to legitimacy. Rulers aim to influence both the material conditions and personal lives of their subjects. One of the key achievements during Egypt's first to third dynasties was the establishment of a truly centralized national administration. At the beginning of this period, Egypt had only recently been unified. Narmer and his immediate successors faced the daunting task of governing a vast territory stretching roughly 500 miles from inland Africa to the Mediterranean coast. By the end of this era, the state operated a tightly controlled economy that funded large-scale royal construction efforts. This accomplishment was the result of persistence, ingenuity, and above all, far-reaching ambition. Among humanity's most transformative inventions, writing holds a unique status. Its influence on preserving knowledge, wielding authority, and chronicling the past is profound. Today, it is almost impossible to conceive of a world without written communication. For the ancient Egyptians, the advent of writing must have been groundbreaking. Although the precise origins of hieroglyphic writing remain uncertain, growing evidence suggests it was the result of intentional creation. The earliest known Egyptian inscriptions have been found on bone tags from a pre-dynastic burial site at Abydos, associated with a ruler who lived over a century before Narmer. These inscriptions already used developed symbols, and the system displayed the complexity that would characterize hieroglyphic writing for over 3,000 years. Scholars continue to debate whether Egypt or Mesopotamia first conceived of writing. However, southern Mesopotamia appears to have the stronger claim. It is likely that the idea of writing reached Egypt as part of a broader wave of Mesopotamian cultural influence in the pre-unification era. Yet the writing system itself did not accompany this exchange. Egyptian hieroglyphs are so well adapted to the native language and so deeply rooted in the local environment that they almost certainly developed independently within Egypt. One can imagine a visionary figure at the court of an early ruler examining mysterious symbols on imported Mesopotamian goods and creating a comparable system for the Egyptian language. Though this may sound speculative, it resembles the documented invention of the Korean script by King Sejong and his scholars in the 15th century. There are few more plausible explanations for the sudden emergence of a fully developed hieroglyphic writing system in Egypt. Regardless of how it originated, writing was quickly adopted by Egypt's earliest rulers, who saw its immense value. In an era marked by rival kingdoms vying for influence, the ability to document the possession of goods and share that information was a remarkable breakthrough. From the outset, goods moving in and out of the royal treasury were marked with the king's emblem, specifically his Horus name. Items meant for the royal tomb carried tags detailing not only the owner but also specifics such as the contents, their quantity, quality, and place of origin. Initially created as a tool for accounting, writing was warmly welcomed by Egypt's administratively inclined society. Throughout Egypt's long history, literacy was confined to a small, privileged class within the government. To be a scribe was to hold a key to political influence. That close connection between literacy and power was established right from the beginning. Writing also had a profound impact on international commerce. Many labels found in the royal tombs at Abydos were originally affixed to jars of fine oil imported from the Near East. A notable increase in such imports during the First Dynasty coincided with the creation of Egyptian settlements and trade hubs across southern Palestine. At locations such as Nahaltila and Tel Arani, in what is now Israel, archaeologists have uncovered Egyptian imported pottery, locally made pottery in Egyptian style, and seal impressions featuring hieroglyphs. At En-Bissor, near modern-day Gaza, the Egyptian administration even established a logistical base to resupply caravans traveling along the coastal trade route connecting Palestine to the Nile Delta. Backed by state support, Egypt's foreign relations entered a phase of increased activity and connectivity. However, official narratives presented a different story. Domestically, the regime projected an image of proud isolation. In the official ideology, the king's sacred duty was to protect Egypt by defeating foreign adversaries, who symbolized disorder and chaos. To cultivate national unity, Egypt's rulers found it useful to portray outsiders as threats. An ivory label from Narmer's tomb, for instance, depicts a dignitary from Palestine bowing before the Egyptian king. In reality, however, Egypt and Palestine were actively engaged in trade. The official xenophobic rhetoric concealed the practical truth. This contrast serves as a cautionary note for historians of ancient Egypt. From the very beginning, Egyptians mastered the art of shaping the written record to reflect the version of reality they wanted others to see. While the written accounts are undoubtedly valuable, they must be examined critically and compared against the more objective findings uncovered through archaeological excavation. While Egypt's interactions with the Near East were marked from the outset by complexity and contradiction, its stance toward Nubia was far more direct and assertive. Even before the First Dynasty began, as the pre-dynastic kingdoms of Chini, Nut, and Nekhen were emerging in Egypt, a similar cultural evolution was taking shape in Lower Nubia, centered around the sites of Sayala and Kustal. This region exhibited signs of a budding civilization, including elaborate burials of rulers, a refined culture, and active trade with nearby territories, Egypt among them. Despite its early promise, Nubia's rise was abruptly halted. Both written records and archaeological findings convey a consistent narrative. Determined to secure control over trade routes and suppress any potential competition, Egypt's earliest monarchs acted quickly to neutralize the emerging Nubian threat. A striking example of this policy can be seen in the inscription at Gebel Sheikh Suleiman, which vividly depicts a giant scorpion clutching a defeated Nubian leader. Another nearby carving, dating to the dawn of the First Dynasty, reinforces the message. It portrays a grim scene of destruction, with fallen Nubians lying under the gaze of the Egyptian king's emblem. Unlike the city-states of the Near East, which could be tolerated due to their geographical distance and their role as trade partners, a neighboring power directly upriver posed a strategic threat that Egypt could not afford to ignore. After Egypt's decisive incursion into Lower Nubia, this portion of the Nile Valley did not emerge again as a serious political force for nearly a millennium. With its borders secure, dominance over the Nile Valley established, and thriving trade connections, the early Egyptian state experienced a significant increase in prosperity. However, this wealth was not shared equally among the population. Burial sites from the period of state formation reveal a sharp divide in grave sizes and the richness of offerings, signaling a growing disparity between the wealthy and the poor. The primary beneficiary of this newfound prosperity was the state itself. Political unification effectively placed all land under royal ownership. Although individuals and communities continued farming their plots as before, they now had to pay rent to a new landlord. The administration of the First Dynasty wasted no time in implementing a comprehensive tax system to capitalize on the country's agricultural output. Writing once again proved indispensable. From the very beginning of its recorded history, the Egyptian state used written documentation to manage the nation's wealth and enforce taxation. Some of the earliest ink inscriptions mention revenues collected from both Upper and Lower Egypt. For efficiency, the country seems to have already been divided into two regions for tax collection. The First Dynasty's desire to oversee every facet of the economy is evident in two key measures, both mentioned on the Palermo stone. The earliest entry refers to a First Dynasty king, likely Aha, Narmer's successor, and describes an event called the Following of Horus, which apparently took place every 2 years. This journey, undertaken by the king and his court along the Nile, served multiple purposes. Like royal tours in Tudor England, it enabled the ruler to maintain a visible presence among his subjects, allowed his officials to monitor provincial affairs, enforce policies, resolve disputes, and administer justice. Additionally, it helped reduce the ongoing cost of maintaining the court in one location by spreading the burden across various regions. Most importantly, it offered an organized method for evaluating and collecting taxes. By the Second Dynasty, the administrative value of the Following of Horus was officially acknowledged, and the journey was merged with a formal agricultural census. Starting with the third ruler of the First Dynasty, the Palermo stone also records annual measurements of the Nile's flood level, noted in cubits and fractions thereof. The reason for this meticulous tracking is clear: the height of the inundation directly influenced the success of the subsequent harvest. Knowing this would have allowed the state to adjust taxes accordingly, ensuring maximum revenue for the royal treasury. In the process of tax collection, it is reasonable to assume that a network of state officials operated throughout Egypt. Their work was undoubtedly supported by the use or threat of force. Inscriptions left behind by some of these officials, often found in the form of seal impressions, provide insight into the operations of the treasury, which stood as the most vital government department from the very beginning of Egypt's history. The agricultural goods collected as state revenue were managed in two main ways. One portion was directed straight to royal workshops, where raw materials were transformed into finished goods: tallow and leather from cattle, pork from pigs, linen from flax, and bread, beer, or baskets from grain. These processed items were either sold or traded to generate additional state income or redistributed as wages to state workers, helping to sustain the royal court and its initiatives. The rest of the collected produce was stored in government-run granaries, likely spread across key administrative centers. Some of this grain was allocated in its raw form to support court operations, but a substantial part was reserved as a contingency supply. This reserve was intended to cushion the impact of failed harvests and reduce the risk of widespread starvation. Whether this policy reflected true concern for public welfare or was simply a calculated strategy to protect state interests depends on one's interpretation. Regardless, the population did benefit from this early form of social safety net, although it came at their own expense. With a national framework established to evaluate, collect, and redistribute tax revenue, Egypt's early monarchs were able to shift their focus toward boosting output. As with most bureaucracies, the administration soon began to develop its own momentum and internal goals. Although improvements in infrastructure may have indirectly helped the general population, it is hard to avoid the conclusion that these advancements primarily served the ruling class. In ancient Egypt, growing national wealth tended to result in the construction of increasingly elaborate monuments that glorified the king, rather than in the creation of public amenities or the enhancement of ordinary living conditions. The government's prioritization of the elite becomes especially clear during the reign of King Den, who ruled in the mid-First Dynasty around 2850 BC. Over the course of his 3 to 4 decades on the throne, numerous innovations emerged across various areas, ranging from the evolution of royal titles to advancements in tomb construction. One such improvement was the introduction of a stairway leading into the burial chamber. Reforms weren't limited to the royal court. According to the Palermo Stone, agricultural lands in the Delta underwent a major reorganization during Den's reign, possibly requiring entire communities to relocate in order to establish royal estates. This suggests the government's role as a landowner was far from compassionate. This reassignment of large sections of Lower Egypt as crown property served as a precursor to more extensive administrative changes. To tighten control over the country, the state introduced a new system of local governance, dividing both the Delta and the Nile Valley into 42 provinces, or nomes. Each of these provinces was governed by a nomarch. In Upper Egypt, these divisions appear to have followed long-standing community borders that had their roots in ancient irrigation systems. However, in the Delta, where no such traditional divisions existed, the new provinces were likely drawn to accommodate the locations of royal estates. Regardless of their basis, this structured administrative framework replaced earlier, more informal allegiances and granted the monarchy significantly more centralized power. Reform efforts continued into the latter part of the First Dynasty. The increased number of high-ranking officials granted elaborate, state-funded burials points to a growing and more organized bureaucracy. At North Saqqara, leading members of the court constructed large mud brick tombs, known as mastabas, along the cliff's edge. Oriented toward the sunrise and overlooking the capital, these grand structures symbolized both rebirth and the preservation of high social standing in the afterlife. Their facades, designed to mimic the White Wall of Memphis, underscored their connection to royal authority. After all, the king was the ultimate source of power, and most of these top officials were closely related to the royal family. One of the notable tombs at North Saqqara was constructed for a man named Hemika, who held the influential role of chancellor and chief of the treasury under King Denver. Among the items buried with him was a small wooden box, intricately inlaid and containing 2 rolls of papyrus. These artifacts perfectly illustrate the strong link between literacy and political authority in early Egyptian society. In fact, the earliest known autobiographical inscription from the Nile Valley appears on the tombstone of one of Hemika's successors. Merka, who served the final monarch of the First Dynasty, held an assortment of titles that reveal much about the nature of high-ranking roles at the time. Despite his various responsibilities tied to the royal court, Merka's prominence primarily stemmed from a prestigious religious position within the royal cult. For officials like Merka, advancement was entirely dependent on their closeness to the king. His eclectic mix of administrative, ceremonial, and spiritual titles reflects an early bureaucratic system that was still relatively fluid and undefined. Outside of the treasury, clearly defined roles were rare, and proximity to royal authority was the key to influence. The grand tombs built at North Saqqara for figures like Hemika and Merka were not simply rewards for faithful service. Rising above the landscape, they stood as symbols of authority and dominance. This architectural expression of centralized rule could be seen across the Nile Valley, from Giza and Tarkhan in the north to Jebel and Armant in the south. The emergence of large-scale tombs designed in the palace facade style, towering over local communities, must have had a deep psychological effect on the population. The impact would have been similar to the construction of motte and bailey castles in England following the Norman conquest. The reach of the state extended into every region. A new era of control had begun. Another powerful demonstration of early state dominance took place at Egypt's southern border, on the island of Abu. At the dawn of the First Dynasty, the government rapidly established a massive fortified customs station there to control and monitor the flow of people and goods between Egypt and Nubia. That this fortress was constructed on a raised section of the island, blocking access to a local religious shrine, clearly showed where the state's priorities lay. Economic oversight and political dominance far outweighed any concern for local traditions or sacred spaces. From the very beginning of its history, the Egyptian state exhibited an assertive approach to governance. For the ancient Egyptians, the cost of national unity, administrative efficiency, and economic prosperity was authoritarian rule. The death of Ka, the final ruler of Egypt's first dynasty around 2750 BC, was commemorated with the customary royal burial rites at the ancestral necropolis of Abydos. His funeral procession solemnly traveled from his palace of eternity to his distant tomb among the graves of past monarchs. This burial site was carefully chosen to align with a distinctive gap in the nearby cliffs, believed by the ancient Egyptians to be a gateway to the underworld. Ka's remains were laid to rest in his burial chamber, accompanied by an abundance of offerings meant to sustain his soul in the afterlife. To serve him in death as they had in life, a number of attendants were buried in surrounding subsidiary tombs. Once the arrangements were complete, the tomb was sealed under the watchful eye of Ka's successor, the new king, Hatshepsut. The transition of leadership was smooth, signaling the start of a new reign. At first glance, there was little indication that Hatshepsut's rule would mark a significant departure from tradition. However, later historians recognized him as the founder of a new dynasty. This designation was prompted by his bold decision to break from over 3 centuries of royal burial tradition at Abydos and establish a new funerary site far to the north at Saqqara, overlooking the royal capital of Memphis. The exact reasons behind this dramatic relocation remain uncertain. Hatshepsut may have had familial connections to the Memphis region, or perhaps he felt that a royal tomb, as a potent symbol of kingship, should be placed at the geographic midpoint of Upper and Lower Egypt, rather than in a southern province. Regardless of the reasoning, the shift in burial location was accompanied by equally innovative architectural choices. Unlike the traditional mud brick structures aligned with the local landscape, Hatshepsut's tomb was oriented to true north and excavated directly into the rock. The tomb's layout also diverged from earlier designs. It consisted of a sequence of lengthy corridors branching off from a central passageway, instead of a central chamber flanked by storerooms. At its end, the tomb featured a suite of rooms that mirrored the private living spaces of a contemporary household. Hatshepsut clearly intended for his spirit not only to receive sustenance in the afterlife but also to enjoy the comforts of a fully equipped residence. The successors of Hatshepsut, Kings Nebra and Ninetjer, upheld his reforms and continued the tradition of royal burials at Saqqara. However, the apparent stability during the Second Dynasty concealed growing unrest throughout the kingdom. Around the midpoint of Ninetjer's reign, approximately 2700 BC, signs of internal conflict began to emerge. A cryptic note on the Palermo stone refers to the destruction of Shemare in the north, hinting at possible attempts by Lower Egypt to break away from centralized rule. This could account for the fact that the rulers who follow Ninetjer are largely absent from records in the southern part of Egypt. It's possible that the early dynasties' emphasis on Upper Egypt had fostered resentment among the northern population. Evidence from the later Second Dynasty suggests a deepening political divide. Several generations after Abydos had been abandoned as a royal necropolis, it was reinstated as the burial site by a ruler who made an extraordinary departure from tradition. Rather than aligning himself with Horus, this king identified with Seth, the god of the desert and protector of the town of Nut. This figure, known as Peribsen, ruled around 2680 BC and remains unique in ancient Egyptian history for this religious shift. While the exact motives for his decision remain uncertain, it's plausible that devotion to Seth resonated with his southern power base. Despite this departure in divine affiliation, Peribsen maintained many of the ceremonial and institutional hallmarks of Egyptian monarchy. His tomb at Abydos was consciously styled after those of the First Dynasty, evoking the early days of the pharaonic state. Notably, he was the first ruler since Ka to construct a separate funerary palace in the area, emphasizing continuity even in a time of upheaval. Taken together, the written and archaeological evidence from this period points to a time of crisis. The fragile unity achieved by Egypt's early rulers had been shaken, and the very foundation of kingship faced its greatest test since the era of unification. What Egypt required was a strong leader capable of restoring order and reaffirming royal authority before the entire system collapsed. That leader emerged in the form of Kasekum. It is possible that, without him, ancient Egyptian civilization might have stalled in its early stages, never achieving the monumental advancements for which it later became known. Kasekum, whose name means the power has appeared, embodied the resolve needed to guide Egypt into a new era. He stands as a pivotal figure, bridging the gap between a culture rooted in prehistoric traditions and a fully realized pharaonic society defined by ambition and monumental vision. Like Peribsen, Kasekum likely hailed from Upper Egypt and drew his authority from the southern regions. He showed particular favor to the city of Nekhen, commissioning statues and stone vessels for its temples and beginning the construction of an enormous enclosure behind the city. Known today as a fort, this structure remains the oldest surviving mud brick building in the world, with walls still standing 34 feet high more than 4,500 years after their construction. Kasekum's intention to rule as a conventional monarch was made clear when he reinstated the traditional royal titulary, presenting himself as the earthly embodiment of Horus, the sky god. In doing so, he reaffirmed the legitimacy of the monarchy and paved the way for the great achievements that would define ancient Egypt's golden age. Kasekum's determination to reunite Egypt was as essential to its future as his public demonstrations of royal power. His ambition to restore unity to the two lands and bring the entire country under a single rule was unmistakable. Two life-size statues of the king from Nekhen depict him wearing the ceremonial Jubilee robe, one of the oldest royal traditions. Notably, the statues' bases do not feature his titles, but rather graphic depictions of fallen enemies, twisted in defeat. The hieroglyphic inscriptions declare the figure 47,209 northern enemies. Similar imagery appears on stone vessels from the same temple, where scenes of victory are carved into the surfaces. The vulture goddess of Upper Egypt, Nekhbet, is shown standing atop a ring containing the word rebel, accompanied by an inscription that reads, "The year of fighting the northern enemy." These accounts appear to document a military campaign led by Kasekum to subdue rebellious factions in Lower Egypt and bring them back under central authority. His vision was daring, but with strong leadership, it quickly became reality. To commemorate the reunification of Egypt, Kasekum altered his royal name and titles in a symbolic gesture. He adopted the name Kasekemli, meaning the two powers have appeared, along with the phrase the two lords are at peace in him. For the first time, the symbols of both Horus and Seth were shown side by side above the royal name, signifying the reconciliation of opposing forces within the figure of the king himself. Unity had been restored, conflict had ended, and balance returned to the land. This renewed national unity brought about a fresh wave of economic prosperity and cultural revival, grounded in firm state control over the nation's wealth. The Palermo stone notes the reintroduction of a regular census encompassing both Egypt's mineral and agricultural assets. With replenished state resources, Egypt re-established commercial ties with the Near East. Unlike earlier periods, which focused on southern Palestine, the attention now shifted to the port of Kebni. To solidify diplomatic relations, the king gifted the local temple with a stone vessel bearing an inscription. In return, Kebni's merchants provided Egypt with two essential materials, cedar wood and tin. Cedar, in particular, was vital for constructing ships, as Egypt lacked its own supply of quality timber. Large seafaring vessels were crucial to maintaining trade across the eastern Mediterranean. An inscription from the 17th year of Kheskemwi's reign, around 2655 BC, references shipbuilding efforts. The results of Egypt's access to tin are evident in the royal tomb at Abydos, where a ewer and basin represent the earliest known bronze artifacts from the Nile Valley. The advancement of bronze technology, combined with increased trade revenue, enabled a surge in state-sponsored construction projects. Kheskemwi stands out as the most prolific builder in the early history of Egypt. He commissioned new temples throughout Upper Egypt, and completed his cult enclosure at Nekhen before focusing his efforts on Abydos. Following the example set by his immediate predecessor, he selected this ancient royal burial site for his own funerary monuments. His enclosure at Abydos was even larger than the one at Nekhen and continues to dominate the surrounding landscape today. Regarding his royal tomb, the architects introduced a completely new design that blended traditions from both the first and early second dynasties. This approach seemed to declare that all previous advances in Egyptian civilization were now unified under his rule. Additionally, he looked forward to the future. His burial chamber was lined with meticulously cut limestone blocks on a scale never before attempted, foreshadowing architectural developments to come. It was once believed that Kheskemwi's construction activities were limited to Upper Egypt. However, recent surveys and excavations indicate that he also left a significant mark in the north. Deep in the desert at Saqqara, far beyond the usual tourist routes and even past where camel caravans travel, lie the ruins of a massive enclosure. This site is best seen from the air, as its walls appear on the ground only as low ridges. The size is enormous. Its local Arabic name, Jisr al-Mudir, translates to the enclosure of the boss. Partial excavations reveal walls made of massive stone blocks arranged in sloping layers, with solid masonry corners. Although no inscriptions have been discovered to definitively date Jisr al-Mudir, evidence increasingly suggests that Kheskemwi was its builder, making it the third grand enclosure constructed during his reign. Once completed, it would have been the largest and most impressive royal monument Egypt had ever seen. In this way, Kheskemwi ushered the nation to the brink of a new era. The pyramids of Giza remain the only surviving wonder of the ancient world. While the Hanging Gardens of Babylon have vanished without a trace and the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus lies in ruins, the pyramids still rise from the desert with the same awe-inspiring presence they held when they were first constructed over 4,500 years ago. Of the three pyramids built by successive rulers of Egypt's fourth dynasty, it is the oldest and largest that commands the most attention, and rightfully so. This colossal structure is composed of around 2.3 million stone blocks, each weighing over a ton on average, and spans a base of 13 acres. A simple estimate shows that placing each block would have required the workers to position one every 2 minutes during a 10-hour workday, year-round, for the entirety of Khufu's 20-year reign. When completed, the pyramid stood at an incredible 481 feet tall, a record it held as the world's tallest structure for 44 centuries. What's even more astonishing than its size is its precision. The Great Pyramid is aligned almost perfectly with true north, deviating by a mere 1/20th of a degree. Its engineering continues to baffle and impress experts and enthusiasts alike, sparking a wide range of theories about how it was built and why. Some suggest the blocks were formed using ancient concrete, others propose more far-fetched ideas, such as them being levitated by sound. Various speculative theories even involve mythical civilizations like Atlantis or alien intervention. Yet the real explanation may be even more remarkable. The Great Pyramid wasn't the work of otherworldly beings. but the result of an extraordinary human endeavor. This bold expression of royal authority deeply influenced the evolution of ancient Egyptian society. To understand its roots, we must look back to the era preceding Khufu's reign, during the rule of his father. The Egyptian fascination with massive stone structures can be traced back to prehistoric ceremonial sites such as Nabta Playa. The construction of grand monuments began to take shape under King Khafre at the close of the Second Dynasty. The first pyramid appeared under his successor, Nedjeriket, at the start of the Third Dynasty. However, it was during the reign of Sneferu, the first king of the Fourth Dynasty and Khufu's father, that the true geometric pyramid came into being. This was more than an architectural breakthrough. As often occurred in ancient Egypt, a new political order was declared first through the king's titles. Sneferu chose the Horus name Neb-Mat, the most ancient and symbolically potent of the royal epithets. Though often translated as Lord of Truth, this phrase carries much deeper meaning. In Egyptian thought, Mat represented a cosmic ideal, truth, justice, balance, and divine order. The term Neb implied not only lordship but also ownership and stewardship. With this name, Sneferu presented a new kind of kingship. No longer merely a dispenser of justice, the king now embodied the very essence of truth. His word wasn't just law. This was no ordinary authority, it bordered on the divine. That, in fact, was the intention. To emphasize his message, Sneferu assumed a new royal title, Nedjer Nefer, which translates to the perfect God. But did his people truly see him that way? Throughout history, autocrats and despots have adopted grandiose titles often more reflective of propaganda than genuine admiration. These titles tend to serve as tools of control rather than signs of sincere devotion. Yet when it comes to ancient Egypt, scholars are often hesitant to apply such a critical lens. Some experts have claimed that popular support for the system was authentic and widespread, noting the apparent absence of coercive enforcement tools like police. Unless Egypt under the Fourth Dynasty was an unprecedented utopia, such a rosy interpretation seems doubtful. When a ruler is declared the perfect God, resistance becomes more than risky. And when that same ruler controls the historical narrative, it's no wonder there are no recorded accounts of suppression or violence. Still, archaeology tells a more complex story. During the first three dynasties, Egyptian society retained many features of its prehistoric roots. Pottery, stone vessels, and even statues followed pre-dynastic designs. Regional power centers remained largely unchanged, rooted in places like Inerti, Nekheb, Tchini, Nut, and Nekhen. Society outside the royal court also appeared to remain traditional, structured around extended families, local communities, and possibly tribal affiliations. This traditional framework began to shift dramatically with the start of the Fourth Dynasty. The royal court introduced new styles of ceramics and sculpture, produced in state-controlled workshops. The government established new urban centers, displacing older ones. These changes suggest a coordinated state initiative aimed at reducing regional independence and replacing it with total reliance on centralized authority. Even in matters of death and burial, the king's influence extended far and wide. Those who held any position in the government machinery now sought to be buried near the king's monumental tomb, in a cemetery established and dominated by his massive funerary complex, rather than in their ancestral burial grounds steeped in local heritage. The earliest of these new cemeteries was constructed at Midam, a remote location at the entrance to the Fayum region. The decision to build there was intentional. By rejecting the traditional royal necropolises at Abydos and Saqqara, Sneferu was also symbolically distancing himself from his predecessors. This era was intentionally progressive, aiming to establish authority through merit rather than lineage. To reflect this new age, a dramatic architectural statement was needed. Sneferu's architects and laborers began work on a monument that would eclipse all previous attempts. Though it maintained the basic concept of Nedjeriket's step pyramid, the Midam pyramid was significantly more ambitious, featuring 8 enormous steps compared to Nedjeriket's 6 and reaching a height 1.5 times greater than its predecessor. Departing further from tradition, Sneferu abandoned the cluster of buildings that typically surrounded a step pyramid. Instead, he introduced a linear design, aligning structures along a single axis. This pathway extended eastward from the pyramid, past a small temple and along a stone causeway to a valley temple at the edge of cultivated land. The orientation of this layout was no coincidence. It mirrored the sun's journey across the sky, rising in the east and setting in the west. As the perfect god, Snefru was publicly linking himself to the sun god, the highest deity and giver of life, asserting a divine legitimacy that placed his rule beyond question. Yet even this ambitious achievement was not enough to satisfy Snefru's boundless aspirations. Around 10 years into his reign, with the Midim pyramid nearly finished, the king launched an even more daring endeavor. He selected a new, untouched site at the southern edge of the Memphis necropolis. Perhaps intentionally, this location lay within view of Nedriket's step pyramid, but Snefru's vision was to create a monument that would mark a clear break from the past. His goal was not simply to build a bigger pyramid, but to construct Egypt's first true, geometrically shaped pyramid. The symbolic allusions to the sun found at Midim were now made explicit. The new pyramid would represent a solid beam of sunlight carved in stone. Even its name, appearance, used the same term the Egyptians employed for the sunrise. This was more than architecture. Construction began on an expansive 8.5-acre site, and plans were drawn for the most majestic pyramid to date, with sides angled steeply at 60 degrees and a proposed height approaching 500 feet. Accompanying this grand pyramid were a smaller one for the king's ka, a modest chapel, a long stone causeway, and a valley temple intended for the performance of royal funerary rites. All of these elements were conceived as part of one unified plan. To support such a colossal endeavor, an immense administrative operation was necessary. Records from the Palermo stone dated to the 14th year of Snefru's reign detailed the establishment of 35 royal estates, complete with labor forces, along with 122 cattle farms. A significant number of these facilities were located in the vast Delta region. One site in particular, Emu, modern Qom el-Hizn, grew into a prominent settlement, showing how state policies reshaped Egypt's population and economy during the Old Kingdom. Despite the impressive scale of livestock management at Emu, the local residents did not share in its bounty. Archaeological evidence shows that beef and other cattle products were rare in their diet, indicating that most of the livestock was diverted directly to the royal court and associated temples near Memphis. Even the grain cultivated there seems to have been prioritized for feeding the cattle, not the people tending them. This starkly illustrates the self-serving nature of Egypt's monarchy. Rather than an enlightened form of rule, this was autocracy in its purest form. While the fertile lowlands of the Delta were ideal for raising cattle, the royal estates in Upper Egypt focused on producing grains, especially barley. The climate and the Nile's seasonal flooding made the region perfect for agriculture. As the floodwaters receded in early autumn, farmers would sow seeds across the freshly irrigated and nutrient-rich land. Crops germinated quickly during the cool winter months, and as summer arrived, the grain ripened, ready to be harvested before the next inundation began. These favorable conditions made it relatively easy to produce more than was needed, and the state was quick to claim a large portion of this surplus through taxation to support its vast projects. The results of this economic system are vividly illustrated in reliefs from the Dashur Valley Temple. Along the temple walls, rows of female figures are shown carrying offerings for the king's mortuary cult. Through this visual narrative, Snefru broadcast a clear message: his pyramid was not just a royal project, but a national one. Every corner of Egypt was involved. While Snefru could command his people and their resources, he remained powerless against the forces of nature. As construction of his grand pyramid at Dashur reached its midpoint, geological issues unexpectedly arose. Cracks began forming in the outer casing. The sandy and shale-rich soil lacked the strength to bear the pyramid's immense weight, causing the foundation to begin settling unevenly. In a rushed attempt to stabilize the project, additional stone was added around the base to flatten the slope from its original angle to 54 degrees. But the damage was already done. Fissures spread through the internal chambers and corridors. The builders tried numerous solutions, including applying plaster, reinforcing with new stone linings, and even supporting ceilings with imported timber. Eventually, the architectural team, desperate to salvage both the monument and their reputations, made a drastic change. They modified the design halfway through construction, reducing the angle further to 43 degrees. Smaller stones were used for the upper portion, and unlike the earlier inward-sloping courses that had added structural stress, the new blocks were laid horizontally to distribute the weight more evenly. The result was a completed, but visibly compromised structure. Though it reached a height of 346 feet, the now infamous bent pyramid failed to meet the lofty ideals of an eternal tomb for a divine ruler. Defeated and demoralized, Sneferu's team was left with no choice. Although the bent pyramid was no longer viable as a royal tomb, it still had to be finished. Leaving it incomplete would have been an unacceptable failure. As work on it continued, plans were simultaneously set in motion for a third, even more ambitious pyramid. This time, lessons from earlier missteps were fully applied. The new site was selected for its stable geological foundation. From the start, the slope was limited to 43 degrees, and all stones were laid in horizontal courses to prevent internal stress. With time running short, the state mobilized a massive workforce and resources on an unprecedented scale. As a precaution, builders also returned to Midam, where they began transforming the original step structure into a true pyramid by encasing it in smooth masonry. At one point, construction was simultaneously underway on 3 separate monuments, an extraordinary demand on Egypt's labor and supply systems. The increase in construction speed was remarkable. During the first 10 years of Sneferu's reign, roughly 46,000 cubic yards of stone were laid annually at Midam. This rate more than doubled to 105,000 cubic yards per year during work on the bent pyramid. In his third decade, with operations spread across multiple sites, that number soared to between 130,000 and 200,000 cubic yards annually. Not even Khufu's Great Pyramid, built by Sneferu's son, likely surpassed this rate of construction. Calculations suggest that Sneferu's third pyramid may have been completed in just 10.5 years. The increasing difficulty of lifting stones higher as the structure rose was offset by the decreasing volume of stone required near the top. The first 11 of the 157 total stone courses accounted for 20% of the pyramid's volume. By the time workers reached the 66th course, they had completed around 80% of the total volume. Thanks to tireless effort and relentless speed, the Red Pyramid was completed on schedule. At last, the most prolific pyramid builder in Egyptian history had a monument that matched his ambitions. The name Appearance, once applied to the bent pyramid, was now fittingly reassigned to the Red Pyramid, while the flawed predecessor was renamed Southern Appearance, a title that quietly acknowledged its shortcomings. The Red Pyramid's elegance was not limited to its exterior. Its interior featured a refined architectural design, with gracefully corbelled ceilings creating vaulted, pyramid-like chambers that mirrored the monument's outer form. While 2 rooms were constructed at ground level, a third was situated higher within the structure. In death, as in life, the king was to be lifted above the ordinary world, placed closer to the heavens than to the earth. While the craft of pyramid construction was steadily refined under Sneferu, it reached unprecedented heights under his son. Little is known about Khufu as an individual, and the records of his reign are sparse. However, it's likely that he was raised in the shadow of his father's achievements, shaped by a royal environment deeply engrossed in monumental building. Determined to surpass Sneferu's legacy, Khufu set out to create the most magnificent funerary monument ever built. The Great Pyramid of Giza represents the pinnacle of not only Egyptian royal ambition but also the broader human impulse to express absolute power through monumental architecture. On one hand, it is a stark display of unrestrained political and economic authority. On the other, it stands as a singular marvel in the annals of human history. This duality is what continues to captivate us about Khufu's towering legacy. From the very beginning, the Great Pyramid was intended to break all existing limits. Khufu selected the Giza Plateau as the site, a location that, like Dashur, could be seen from Saqqara and had never before been built upon. The area's natural foundation was exceptionally well suited to bear the tremendous load of such a massive structure. The abundant local stone and the seasonal access provided by the Nile during its flooding allowed for the efficient transport of materials to the site from across the country. The king also demonstrated foresight in choosing the man to lead this grand endeavor. Throughout much of the Fourth Dynasty, the highest roles in the state were typically entrusted to close male relatives of the king, reflecting a deliberate strategy to centralize authority. For the most significant construction of his reign, Khufu appointed a trusted family member. Though Himeyuna's royal lineage certainly gave him access to elite positions, his swift ascent suggests he also possessed considerable talent. At the height of his career, he held an impressive array of titles spanning the royal court, religious institutions, and the state bureaucracy. These included Elder of the Palace, High Priest of Thoth, and even the curious title of Director of Music of the South and the North, which may hint at a personal passion. Yet, his most consequential responsibilities were administrative. He served as overseer of royal scribes, effectively the head of the civil service, and as overseer of all royal construction projects. Among all of Khufu's architectural ventures, none rivaled the importance of the Great Pyramid. Himeyuna managed the entire undertaking, from organizing supplies and labor to extracting and transporting stone, from constructing the ramps to coordinating the engineers, designers, and site supervisors. A life-size statue of Himeyunu, discovered in his tomb at Giza, depicts a man relishing the privileges of high rank. His corpulent physique symbolizes his wealth, while his sharp nose and strong jaw convey authority and resolve. Despite his elite background, such confidence and determination would have been essential as he stood on the vast plateau at the beginning of his uncle's reign, preparing to face one of the most formidable challenges in the history of architecture. The initial phase in constructing a pyramid was preparing and laying out the site. The remarkable alignment of the Great Pyramid with the cardinal directions suggests that the builders relied on stellar observations to establish true north, as solar-based methods lack the required precision. Although the exact process remains unknown, it likely involved observing a pair of stars that circled the celestial North Pole. When the stars aligned vertically, they would provide an accurate directional reference. One can envision this ritual being conducted with solemn ceremony, perhaps in the presence of priests, with Himeyunu and possibly the king himself overseeing it. This orientation was essential, as the pyramid's function in ensuring the king's resurrection in the afterlife depended on its precise alignment. After determining the correct orientation and leveling the site, the stage was set for actual construction to begin. While the sheer scale of the project seems staggering by today's standards, Khufu's administration, benefiting from decades of experience building monumental pyramids, likely approached it with pragmatic confidence. The Egyptians managed such enormous endeavors by breaking them down into smaller, more manageable tasks. The workforce was organized into small units, probably composed of about 20 men under the guidance of a team leader. This structure not only improved efficiency but also fostered team spirit and a healthy sense of competition. Larger organizational units are evident in inscriptions that have survived. 10 teams formed a group of 200 men. 5 phils combined to make a gang of 1,000 workers, each with its own leadership and identity. 2 gangs came together to form a crew, the largest labor unit, sometimes bearing humorous or informal names such as the King's Drunkards. This tiered organization mirrored the pyramid's shape itself and served much like a military hierarchy, cultivating pride and identity at every level. Teams competed against one another, phils with phils, and gangs with gangs, all striving for excellence and recognition. It was a brilliant yet straightforward system that kept morale high across a vast labor force. Such motivation was necessary. Over the 20 years it took to complete the Great Pyramid, the labor was grueling, constant, and dangerous. The main quarry, located just a few hundred yards south of the pyramid site, must have been particularly harsh. Workers faced clouds of choking limestone dust, the intense glare of sunlight bouncing off the quarry walls, the constant clamor of tools striking stone, buzzing flies, and the overpowering odor of sweat and toil. New recruits began their service in these harsh conditions, driven by the hope of promotion. Yet even promotion didn't guarantee easier work. Transporting the immense stone blocks from the quarry to the pyramid base was punishing labor. Each block, weighing over a ton, had to be pried onto a wooden sledge, then dragged by ropes along a smooth path to the site. Once there, the stone had to be carefully removed, positioned, and shaped. The pace of this relentless task was staggering. Despite the colossal scale of Khufu's pyramid, it remains fundamentally a human accomplishment, entirely within the capabilities of ancient Egyptian society. Modern calculations and hands-on experiments suggest that only 2 labor crews would have been needed to quarry, transport, and position the more than 2 million stone blocks that make up the monument. A workforce of similar size may have been necessary to construct and maintain the immense ramps connecting the main quarry to the pyramid and extending upward as the structure rose. Supporting this massive operation was another group of workers engaged in essential behind-the-scenes roles: carpenters who crafted the wooden sledges for moving stone, water carriers who wetted the tracks to ease transportation, potters who made water jars and everyday kitchenware, metalworkers who forged and repaired copper tools, and a team of bakers, brewers, and cooks to feed the entire workforce. Even with all these contributors, the number of people actively involved in the project at any one time likely didn't exceed 10,000. A core group of skilled workers resided near the pyramid year-round with their families. However, the majority of the labor force consisted of temporary workers who served for a few months before returning to their villages across Egypt. The residential area for these workers offers intriguing insights into their daily routines. During the construction of the Great Pyramid, the main workers' settlement, known as Jurjit Khufu, settlement of Khufu, was established near cultivated land close to the Valley Temple. Large deposits of broken pottery, animal bones, charcoal, and ash reveal an area bustling with activity, largely centered around providing meals for the thousands of laborers. Further south on the Giza Plateau, a larger settlement emerged during later dynasties, highlighting the high degree of organization behind pyramid construction. This later town, enclosed by a massive stone wall 30 feet high and thick at its base, was deliberately designed to reflect the hierarchical structure of the workforce. The layout closely mirrored the pyramid-like organization used to manage labor on the construction site. Workers lived in basic accommodations. Rows of earth beds lined the walls of long, narrow barracks, each unit likely housing 2 teams of 20 men. Toward the rear, slightly more comfortable quarters were probably set aside for team leaders. The site overseer occupied a detached villa offering a higher standard of living. Nearby stood a columned hall that likely served as a communal dining area, fostering solidarity and fellowship among workers. Given the demands of such intense physical labor, the workers required a diet high in protein. Each day, butchers processed up to 11 cattle and 30 sheep or goats to provide fresh meat, supplementing the standard fare of dried fish. Meanwhile, numerous bakeries churned out vast quantities of bread and beer. Grain, the cornerstone of their diet, was strictly rationed and securely stored. Granaries and silos were located in a royal administrative complex protected by double enclosure walls at the edge of the town, ensuring careful oversight. Although camaraderie and a sense of shared purpose thrived among the laborers, there was always a clear reminder of their ultimate duty and allegiance. One of the most captivating questions about Khufu's massive construction effort centers on its purpose. What drove such an extraordinary display of architectural ambition, engineering expertise, and administrative coordination? What could compel 10,000 people to dedicate 2 decades to building a man-made mountain of stone? The straightforward explanation often offered by Egyptologists focuses on the ideology of divine kingship. In this belief system, the pharaoh was viewed as the intermediary between mortals and the gods, the upholder of cosmic balance, and the guardian of Egypt's prosperity and order. Under such a worldview, it's plausible that citizens would willingly contribute their labor to a monumental royal project as a way of honoring and preserving the sacred bond with their ruler. Perhaps so. It's also true that pyramid construction could have functioned as a form of social welfare, offering employment. And it's likely that laborers were better treated than the myths of slavery suggest, provided with shelter and sustenance. Supervisors may have even inspired a sense of pride in the workers by emphasizing the nobility of their mission. Still, the reality on the ground tells a harder truth: the working conditions were grueling, and the labor was not voluntary. When officials arrived in villages to conscript men for state service, it was unlikely to be met with celebration. Life on the Giza Plateau was harsh. The skeletal remains of workers reveal numerous injuries, all signs of relentless physical strain. Accidents were likely common, and many must have died during the construction process, though official records remain silent on such losses. So if the Great Pyramid wasn't exactly a unifying national endeavor that inspired collective pride, what was it? The more uncomfortable answer is that it served as the ultimate demonstration of absolute authority. Throughout history, authoritarian rulers have shown a fascination with vast, imposing structures. Consider the Palace of the People built by Nicolae Ceausescu in Romania, or Felix Houphouët-Boigny's oversized basilica in the remote forests of Ivory Coast. Khufu's Great Pyramid stands as the most ambitious and enduring example of this obsession with grandeur. Unsurprisingly, he later gained a reputation as a tyrant consumed by ego, indifferent to the cost in human lives. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing centuries later, painted a grim picture of Khufu, accusing him of plunging Egypt into despair. According to Herodotus, Khufu closed all temples, banned religious practices, and forced his people into servitude for his own glorification. He claimed that the Egyptians could scarcely speak of Khufu without expressing hatred. This dark legacy wasn't lost on later rulers. When Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Egypt in 1798, he made his way directly to Giza and addressed his troops at the foot of the pyramid, declaring, "Soldiers of France, 40 centuries look down upon you." Beyond its immense scale and seeming permanence, what truly distinguishes the Great Pyramid is its extraordinary precision and sophistication. Its alignment with true north is astonishingly accurate. Even more remarkable are the slender shafts that extend from the burial chamber outward through the solid masonry, stopping just short of the pyramid's exterior. Once mistaken for ventilation channels, these shafts had a far more symbolic function. They were aligned with key stars, Sirius, a star in the Orion constellation, and 2 circumpolar stars near the celestial North Pole. The Egyptians were expert astronomers, and stars played a central role in state religion, particularly in beliefs about the Pharaohs' afterlife. The circumpolar stars, which never set and are always visible, symbolized eternal life and were seen as the perfect metaphor for the king's everlasting existence. In this cosmic vision, the Great Pyramid was more than a tomb. The pyramids of Giza serve as a fitting representation of ancient Egyptian society during the 4th dynasty. Just as the tombs of courtiers and laborers were built around the pharaoh's own funerary complex, the nation as a whole reflected a similar reliance on royal authority. Members of the elite often portrayed themselves as humble scribes, highlighting their loyalty and service to the king. Inscriptions found on tomb walls further echoed this culture of devotion and submission. It is not by chance that one of the most enduring funerary formulae in ancient Egypt first emerged during this period. Inscribed in tomb chapels, on offering tables, and later on coffins, it conveyed the belief that all offerings and sustenance for the deceased and their funerary cult stemmed from the generosity of the king. This concept was encapsulated in the phrase, "an offering which the king gives." The growing reverence for the monarch was also reflected in personal names, where the names of gods were increasingly replaced by those of reigning pharaohs. Children with names like Khufukaf might have grown up with little distinction between the king and the sun god. The design of royal mortuary temples, modeled deliberately on the shrines of deities, further blurred the line between divine and royal. This transformation in the relationship between ruler and subjects marked a significant elevation of the monarchy, seen not only in Giza but across even the most distant territories of Egypt. Inscriptions found in the harsh mountains of Sinai in the northeast and on isolated rock formations in the southwestern desert provide evidence of state-sponsored expeditions launched by Khufu and his successors. These missions aimed to retrieve valuable stones for the royal workshops, where they would be crafted into statues, jewelry, and other luxurious items that reinforced the king's authority and magnificence. The extravagant, even decadent, nature of Khufu's court is perhaps most vividly illustrated by 2 tombs discovered near the Great Pyramid. One belonged to a dwarf named Pernyanku, who likely entertained the king and his family through singing and dancing, similar to a jester in a medieval court. Such scenes of celebration and indulgence in the royal palace stand in stark contrast to the lives of laborers who, after a day of grueling work on the Giza plateau, return to their cramped quarters to rest. The second tomb contained belongings intended for the king's mother, offering a rare glimpse into the lifestyle of royalty during Egypt's fourth dynasty. Hetepheres, wife of the famed pyramid builder Sneferu and mother of Khufu, was likely a royal daughter herself. Her elevated status was reflected in her luxurious way of life. She traveled in a gilded chair adorned with ebony panels and gold-inlaid hieroglyphs that listed her numerous titles: Mother of the Dual King, Follower of Horus, Advisor to the Ruler, and the Gracious One, whose every word was obeyed. If these titles accurately reflect reality, it seems Hetepheres may have been the only person Khufu answered to. The impression of a mobile royal household is further supported by the other furnishings in her burial chamber, including a bed with a detachable canopy and 2 compact chairs. The furniture was elegant and simple, yet finely crafted from rich materials, designed for easy transport and assembly. This combination of refinement and mobility captured the confident yet understated opulence that characterized the Fourth Dynasty. Among her most cherished items were her jewelry boxes, one of which was custom-made to hold 20 silver bracelets. A depiction of Hetepheres in her traveling chair shows her wearing 14 of these bracelets along one arm. At the time, silver was more valuable than gold. The bracelets were further embellished with turquoise, lapis lazuli, and carnelian, presenting a dazzling image of a queen whose appearance matched her royal status as the mother of a powerful king. Even Khufu, however, could not escape death. Around 2525 BC, he passed away and was laid to rest in his monumental pyramid at Giza. His funeral was conducted by his son and successor, Djedefre. Unlike his father, Djedefre did not continue the tradition of building massive monuments. He chose to construct a smaller pyramid at a new location on the northern edge of the Memphite necropolis. There may also have been a deeper reason for this relocation. The site faced the city of Yunu, the major center of the sun god Ra's worship. Djedefre appeared deeply devoted to Ra, embracing the sun's radiance as a metaphor for supreme royal power. He aligned himself with this symbolism, seeking to establish a divine connection between king and sun god that paralleled the monumental legacy of his father. His name, meaning Ra speaks, publicly reinforced this association, and he took the unprecedented step of adopting the title Son of Ra. This marked a clear departure from older traditions that centered on Horus, the falcon god, and signaled the dynasty's intent to redefine kingship on its own terms. Under Djedefre's rule, the cult of Ra rapidly gained prominence, eventually becoming the most influential religious movement in Egypt. Ra himself rose to an unparalleled position in the Egyptian pantheon. The two dominant themes of Fourth Dynasty kingship converged in the reign of Djedefre's younger brother and successor, Khafra, who came to power around 2500 BC. He returned to Giza and built his pyramid beside Khufu's, but cleverly selected a slightly higher elevation. Although his pyramid stood slightly shorter than Khufu's, it appeared taller due to its position. A grand causeway descended from Khafra's pyramid to the Valley Temple, which was clad in polished red granite, a stone strongly linked to solar symbolism. Inside, the temple featured a hall paved with brilliant white calcite, symbolizing purification, and was surrounded by 23 life-size statues of the king. These depicted Khafra seated in majesty, with the falcon god Horus perched behind his head in a protective stance. Each statue was sculpted from a single block of black and white banded gneiss, transported from a distant quarry in the western desert. With carefully managed lighting, the effect must have been extraordinary. Yet Khafra's most iconic creation was still to come. He ordered the carving of a natural rock outcrop near his valley temple into the form of a colossal reclining lion with a human head. This majestic sculpture symbolized Khafra's fusion with the sun god and repositioned the entire Giza complex around his own monument. In doing so, Khufu's son not only equaled the Great Pyramid. 3 generations of immense effort went into the pyramid-building enterprises, reshaping Egypt but also placing a heavy burden on its resources. Khafra's successor, Menkaure, was the last to build at Giza. His pyramid was significantly smaller, rising only 216 feet and possessing just a tenth of the volume of Khufu's. Architects tried to compensate by lavishly using red granite, transported from the southern regions, and by constructing a more expansive temple where Menkaura's funerary rituals continued for centuries. Still, the era of giant pyramids had ended. Future kings would need new methods to assert their dominance. An Arabic proverb says, "Man fears time, but time fears the pyramids." The Great Pyramid remains one of the most ambitious architectural feats of antiquity. Khufu, its builder, stood as a towering figure of his age. Yet, in a twist of archaeological irony, the only surviving image of him from his own era is a small ivory statue barely 3 inches tall. Found in the ruins of a temple at Abydos, the figure shows the king seated, wearing the red crown and holding the royal flail. While the symbols of authority are unmistakable, the size is strikingly modest. Once viewed as an autocrat, Khufu has, over time, been quite literally reduced in scale by history. In a crucial respect, the seeming stability of the Pyramid Age was largely a facade. Beneath the surface of royal grandeur, there were signs of internal discord within the ruling family. Amid dynastic tensions during the height of the Fourth Dynasty, subsequent rulers of the Old Kingdom took deliberate action to reassert control over royal succession. These measures eventually laid the groundwork for a different form of kingship and a new social order that would emerge over the next 3 centuries, following the end of pyramid construction at Giza. Considering that Egyptian pharaohs commonly had multiple wives, it is hardly unexpected that their children would compete for influence, as would the mothers themselves. Although such internal power struggles are absent from official records, which aim to portray an image of unshakable royal harmony, subtle clues hint at these hidden rivalries. These include notably brief reigns amid otherwise steady dynastic rule and abrupt policy changes, such as the shift of royal burial sites from Giza to Saqqara at the close of the Fourth Dynasty. After the uninspiring reign of Menkaura's heir, Shepseskaf, a new ruling house emerged. The Fifth Dynasty began with King Userkaf. From the beginning of his reign, he sought to mark a distinct new era, establishing himself as a reformer of governance and kingship. His choice of burial site made this break clear. Disregarding Shepseskaf's unconventional tomb design, Userkaf returned to the classic pyramid structure. More importantly, he located his pyramid at the edge of the ancient step pyramid complex of Nedjeriket, Djoser, a monument already 2 centuries old and revered. In doing so, Userkaf drew a direct connection to a legendary figure of Egypt's past, signaling that, like Djoser's reign, his own would signify a renewed beginning. Yet Userkaf's vision of kingship diverged sharply from the image projected by earlier pyramid builders. While the massive tombs of Nedjeriket and the Fourth Dynasty kings embodied raw political dominance, Userkaf placed greater emphasis on the sacred dimension of his role. His pyramid, modest at just 161 feet tall, was overshadowed by a more groundbreaking structure, a dedicated sun temple at Abusir, situated between Saqqara and Giza. This bold innovation was as significant in its own way as the step pyramid had once been. The sun temple, named Nekanore, consisted of a walled stone compound with a symbolic mound at its center. It was built to highlight the pharaoh's unique and divine connection to the sun god Ra. Ceremonies were conducted in its open-air courtyard, where offerings were made under the sun's rays on an altar placed before the mound. According to period hieroglyphs, the mound may have even supported a wooden perch, allowing the sun god to descend and rest. Appropriately for a structure dedicated to the foremost deity, the Sun Temple had its own estates and priesthood, functioning as a major institution in its own right. In fact, offerings intended for the royal mortuary temple were often routed through the Sun Temple, symbolically sanctifying the supplies before they reached the king's cult. In this way, the Sun Temple acted as a divine intermediary, reinforcing the sacred legitimacy of the pharaoh's rule. The Sun Temples commissioned by Userkaf and his successors during the Fifth Dynasty represented a bold shift in how Egyptian kingship was portrayed. As the monarchy could no longer afford the massive expenses of building colossal pyramids, it sought new ways to affirm its authority and prominence atop the social hierarchy. This transformation involved elevating the king's image even further from that of ordinary mortals, drawing a closer and more defined connection between the ruler and the divine realm. In the earliest dynasties, royal ideology had centered on the king as a living embodiment of the ancient sky god Horus. During the 4th dynasty, Jetafra had introduced the title Son of Are, establishing a symbolic link with the sun god. Building on these theological innovations, Userkaf physically manifested his relationship with Are, eventually being remembered in popular tradition as the actual offspring of the solar deity. This shift marked a transition from overt displays of political dominance to more subtle, religiously grounded assertions of royal power. This symbolic separation of the king from his people extended beyond theology. During the 4th dynasty, tombs of high-ranking officials had surrounded the royal pyramids at Giza, their closeness to the king's tomb reflecting their courtly status. But in the 5th dynasty, a deliberate separation emerged between the sacred ruler and his subjects. In death, as in life, the king was placed apart from commoners. While a new burial ground for elite officials was created at Saqqara, those of lesser rank were relegated to Giza. Meanwhile, the royal tombs themselves continued to move further away, with Userkaf's successors relocating their pyramids to Abu Sur. This physical distancing reflected deeper shifts in governance. In earlier periods, top administrative roles were held exclusively by royal family members. From Snefru through Menkora, every vizier had been a prince, and many heads of construction also came from the royal lineage. In a significant and far-reaching reform, Userkaf broke from this tradition by appointing men of non-royal birth to the highest offices in government. The reasons for this policy change were both ideological and practical. It elevated the royal family above the mundane tasks of administration, preserving their divine aura. Just as importantly, by transferring political authority away from royal princes, Userkaf aimed to reduce the internal disputes that had previously undermined the monarchy's stability. This reform gave rise to a new class of skilled bureaucrats who attained their positions through merit as much as through connections. As the administration evolved to accommodate greater specialization, these professionals assumed responsibilities once handled by princes. Unlike members of the royal family who could hold multiple roles by virtue of birth, professional administrators needed to focus on specific duties. From this point on, it was these capable commoners who became the driving force behind the machinery of the Egyptian state. Lacking inherited status, they had to prove themselves through performance and dedication. The emergence of a professional civil service drawn largely from the common population, along with the creation of a new necropolis where these officials could build their own tombs free from the shadow of the king's pyramid, marked a turning point in Egyptian history. These developments paved the way for the defining funerary monuments of the later Old Kingdom. For the first time, history grants us a detailed glimpse into the lives of those who served the king, revealing a world that was, in many ways, as complex and intriguing as that of the monarchy itself. Above all else, the private tombs constructed during the 5th and 6th dynasties stand as remarkable achievements of artistic expression. The refinement seen in their painted reliefs reflects the mastery of Egyptian artisans, honed through generations of work in the royal necropolises of Dashur and Giza. With greater space available for construction and a desire to outshine their peers, the senior officials of the later Old Kingdom approached the building and embellishment of their tombs with serious intent. Tomb building became a competitive pursuit, with officials often delaying the start of construction in hopes of receiving one final promotion. Special emphasis was placed on decorating the tomb chapel where family members and visitors would bring offerings to the deceased statue. In contrast, the burial chamber, hidden below ground, was usually given only minimal decoration. The phrase "if you've got it, flaunt it" would have resonated strongly with these ancient individuals. Certain motifs were standard in tomb decoration. While an elaborate tomb served as a symbol of personal prestige in the competitive world of the Old Kingdom bureaucracy, its primary purpose was always spiritual, to protect and sustain the eternal soul of the departed. The most crucial scenes were those showing the creation and presentation of offerings, from essential items like bread and beer to luxurious goods such as fine furniture, jewelry, and wine. While these depictions offer rich insight into ancient Egyptian agriculture, craftsmanship, and cuisine, their main goal was not documentary. Instead, they functioned as a magical safeguard, According to Egyptian belief, if the actual grave goods were depleted or destroyed, these images would come to life and provide the deceased with an endless supply of all necessary items. The rows of offering bearers, shown endlessly moving toward the false door that linked the chapel to the burial chamber, were believed to be magically activated to serve the tomb's owner forever. Given the dual purpose of a tomb chapel, it is no surprise that the imagery presents an idealized vision of Egyptian life. Artists were not asked to portray reality, but to create a version of life as the tomb owner wished it to be remembered. The artwork was intended to uphold the existing social structure. For instance, the tomb owner is often shown as a towering figure, dominating each scene, while his servants are rendered at a much smaller scale, often not reaching above his knees. This use of hierarchical proportion, while odd to modern sensibilities, perfectly captures the Egyptians' preoccupation with rank and social position. Another defining characteristic of tomb art is its intentional sense of timelessness. There is little narrative development, scenes seem frozen, disconnected from time and space. Moments such as childhood, marriage, or career advancement are rarely depicted, as including them would mean preserving those stages for eternity. Instead, only the culmination was considered worthy of eternal commemoration in visual form. While scenes from tombs may not serve as accurate records of daily life, they do offer a vivid glimpse into the aspirations and fantasies of Egypt's ancient elite. The leisurely pursuits of the upper class are depicted in great detail. Merodach, a vizier from the early 6th dynasty, is portrayed painting and playing board games. In another depiction, his servants are seen preparing his bed with care, arranging the mattress, headrest, and canopy, before he reclines comfortably as his wife entertains him with harp music. On the rare occasions he was required to engage in official duties, Merodach still traveled in luxury, carried in a shaded palanquin by attendants. These portrayals are, of course, far removed from the harsh conditions endured by the rural populace, both in ancient times and today. Though many high officials of the later Old Kingdom came from non-royal backgrounds, their success in climbing the administrative ladder often led them to distance themselves entirely from the general population, retreating into a world of comfort and privilege. On rare occasions, the grim realities of life outside their elite circles were acknowledged, but only to emphasize the power and authority of the official. In Merodach's tomb, for instance, his life of leisure is starkly contrasted with the harsh punishment inflicted on tax evaders under his jurisdiction. A village leader caught in debt might be forcibly brought to the local tax office, stripped and bound to a post, and flogged with wooden sticks while scribes documented the offense and the punishment. Outside the cloistered world of the elite, life was undeniably harsh and unforgiving. This divide is perhaps most evident in depictions of health. The elite had access to medical care, including doctors and dentists, and they are consistently represented in tomb art as being in excellent physical condition. In contrast, skeletal remains and occasional tomb images suggest that the lower classes suffered from a wide array of chronic illnesses. Many of these diseases, such as schistosomiasis, remain common in Egypt today. It caused symptoms such as blood in the urine and often led to anemia, contributing to poor health and early death. Tuberculosis was also widespread, frequently deforming the spine and exacerbated by relentless physical labor. Evidence of tumors has been found on skeletons from the Old Kingdom, and some tomb scenes may even depict hernia sufferers. But apart from adding visual variety to scenes of laborers at work, illness, disability, and suffering had no place in the idealized vision promoted by the ruling class. The impression left by these depictions is of a governing elite increasingly disconnected from the lives of ordinary Egyptians. Some tomb owners, like Merodach and his predecessor Khejemni, did hold influential posts such as vizier. Yet many others gained their privileged positions not through administrative expertise but through proximity to the king. Irikapta, for example, served as the head of palace butchers, a role central to royal dining, and his tomb at Saqqara suggests the king prioritized fine meals over efficient governance. Similarly, twin brothers Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep, who jointly served as royal manicurists, were rewarded with a lavish tomb for their attentive grooming of the king's hands. Even Kentika, a vizier, owed his advancement less to his political skill than to his intimate service to the monarch. His roles included managing the king's wardrobe, overseeing his attire, guarding the secrets of the bathroom, and even supervising the royal breakfast. In a court immersed in indulgence and ceremonial privilege, the grandest tomb of the Fifth Dynasty at Saqqara was not built for a statesman or an overseer of public works but for Tai, the chief of palace hairdressers. Tai's tomb was an architectural marvel, featuring a large open courtyard bordered by columned porticos on all sides, a long corridor leading to additional chambers, and a dedicated room for his statue. Tai's opulent final resting place reflects a broader truth. Even though the administration had technically opened its doors to those outside the royal family, personal favor with the king remained the most effective route to power and prestige. Despite political reforms, the old traditions of patronage and privilege still held firm. The long-standing tradition of social advancement through royal favor is perfectly illustrated by the life of Hatshepsut, who lived around 2400 BC and held the distinction of owning the largest private tomb from Egypt's Fifth Dynasty. A pivotal moment in his career came when he entered into a second marriage. This union instantly elevated him into the innermost ranks of the royal court. His enhanced status was soon reflected in the expansion of his tomb, including the construction of an impressive entrance hall supported by columns. However, such a rapid rise in prestige came with personal costs. Hatshepsut appears to have disinherited his firstborn son from his earlier marriage, likely in favor of the children from his second, royal union. In his world, allegiance to the crown outweighed familial loyalty. The administrative reforms introduced at the start of the Fifth Dynasty, intended to separate the royal family from the daily functions of government, inadvertently gave rise to a bloated and increasingly arrogant bureaucracy. By the dynasty's midpoint, government roles had become so numerous that a formal hierarchy had to be established to clarify levels of privilege and importance. But as these officials grew in influence, they began to pose a challenge to the king's exclusive hold on authority, a development that could not go unchecked. Around 2350 BC, near the end of the dynasty, the monarchy initiated a sweeping administrative overhaul aimed at cutting down the number of bureaucrats and reining in their expanding influence. A key element of this reform was the decentralization of power, with more duties assigned to provincial officials. While the intention was to reduce the clout of court insiders, this shift inadvertently weakened the central authority of the state. The long-term effects of this policy would prove profound and destabilizing. Once granted a share of authority, the bureaucratic class was not easily restrained. In fact, the very group of officials whose careers shaped the later phase of the Old Kingdom would eventually contribute to its downfall. As the elite class left its imprint through a series of richly adorned tombs, the kings of the Fifth Dynasty focused on creating their own architectural legacy. The successors of Userkaf paid tribute to the sun god Ra through their royal names and constructed their pyramids at Abusir, close to Userkaf's sun temple. Though these pyramids lacked the size and solid construction of their Fourth Dynasty predecessors, they were lavishly and artistically decorated in line with the aesthetic preferences of their time. Saqqara's pyramid complex alone featured an astonishing 12,000 square yards of relief carvings. These decorations introduced new themes, including depictions of deities offering foreign captives to the king and a goddess nursing the pharaoh. The refined taste of the royal court also emerged in the strategic use of contrasting stones. Saqqara's Valley Temple, for example, included red granite dados and palm frond-shaped columns, a black basalt floor, upper walls made of fine white limestone, and a ceiling painted dark blue with gold stars to evoke a night sky. The entire covered causeway ascending the escarpment was lined with reliefs, and the walls of the adjacent mortuary temple were similarly adorned. The result must have been visually breathtaking. The mortuary temple served not only as the spiritual heart of the pyramid complex but also as the sanctuary for the king's statue, which was central to the religious rituals during his life and forever after. In reality, however, few of these cults endured for more than a few generations beyond the pharaoh's death. Still, a remarkable collection of papyrus documents has survived from two mortuary temples at Abusir, offering rare insight into the daily workings of a royal funerary cult in the Old Kingdom. These records reveal a culture heavily invested in meticulous record-keeping, prioritizing procedures and routines over actual care and quality. In Neferukar's temple, the staff operated on a monthly rotation. At the start of each 30-day cycle, incoming personnel were required to carry out a detailed inspection of the temple and its contents. The structure itself was assessed for damage, and every item of furniture or equipment was reviewed against a carefully organized inventory, categorized by material, form, and size. One such document listed items made from stone and flint. Under crystalline stone, in the subsection for white bowls, an inspector noted repairs to the rims, bases, and sides. A flint blade was recorded as missing chips due to being dropped, while a small silver offering table was found to be in poor condition. That these inspections occurred just 50 years after Neferukar's death illustrates how rapidly the temple's furnishings could deteriorate. Yet the emphasis appeared to lie more in the act of recording than in actual preservation. The process of monitoring was valued over maintenance, a classic example of a bureaucracy focused on appearances and routine rather than effectiveness and care, a dynamic familiar in many administratively burdened societies. Records of food and supply deliveries were kept with great care, yet even this diligence could not conceal deeper systemic shortcomings. At Neferukar's Sun Temple, 14 daily consignments of a special type of bread were scheduled. However, in one recorded year, no deliveries were made on the first, second, third, or fourth day of the month. Then, on the fifth day, 70 batches were delivered all at once. The following 6 days saw no deliveries at all, which appeared to have been disregarded entirely. In contrast, the next 11 days' shipments arrived punctually. Even in a society as rigidly organized as ancient Egypt, the regular transfer of essential provisions between royal institutions was not guaranteed. This inconsistency presents a striking contradiction to the image of Egypt as a flawlessly run, efficient civilization. It raises the possibility that the Old Kingdom's administrative system, despite its imposing monuments and apparent prosperity, may have been less stable than it appeared. For those willing to look critically, signs of eventual decline were already emerging. Unas, the final pharaoh of the 5th dynasty, seemed unconcerned with such issues. His focus lay in reimagining royal customs and enriching the ideological framework of kingship. Like Userkaf, he chose to construct his pyramid near the enclosure of Nedriket's step pyramid. But it wasn't just the location that marked Unas as a reformer. His most profound innovation lay beneath the surface, within the burial chambers themselves. Departing from the minimalist, undecorated interiors of earlier pyramids, Unas opted for an ornate design for his eternal dwelling. His coffin was coated in black, representing the fertile earth, while the ceiling of the burial chamber was painted dark blue, dotted with golden stars to reflect the night sky. The walls surrounding the sarcophagus were lined with white alabaster, grooved and painted to replicate a primitive shrine built from wooden frames and reed mats. The chamber was designed to serve as a symbolic representation of the universe. Most revolutionary of all was the inclusion of extensive text covering the walls of both the burial chamber and the anteroom. These texts are known today as the Pyramid Texts. They represent the earliest known collection of religious writings from ancient Egypt and the most substantial surviving body of inscriptions from the Old Kingdom. This diverse compilation of prayers, incantations, and hymns was intended to guide the king through the afterlife, helping him reach the realm of the eternal circumpolar stars. Some of these texts reflect a language and imagery so ancient they likely date back to the very beginnings of Egyptian civilization, while others were likely composed during Unas's reign at the close of the 5th dynasty. Spells, prayers, and incantations likely played a central role in all royal funerals and mortuary rituals throughout Egyptian history. However, the decision to permanently inscribe these words on the interior walls of the king's tomb to serve him eternally was a new development introduced during the reign of Unas. These inscriptions were not placed randomly on any surface. Instead, their arrangement followed a deliberate and symbolic logic, reflecting the sacred layout of the pyramid itself. Texts associated with the underworld were primarily located in the burial chamber, while the antechamber represented the horizon. In this way, the inscriptions worked in harmony with the architecture to intensify the pyramid's magical purpose, to ensure Unaz's resurrection. Yet, the text conveyed more than just magical beliefs. Unaz could anticipate a glorious rebirth not only because of spiritual rights but because he wielded absolute authority. In the theological worldview of his time, the king's divine right was backed by unmatched power. This bold concept is vividly illustrated in one of the most notorious passages of the Pyramid texts. Known as the Cannibal Hymn, it delivers a disturbing image of royal dominance. A short excerpt reveals its stark tone. Unaz is the one who eats men, who feeds on the gods. He consumes their magic, devours their spirits. The mighty ones are his breakfast. The lesser ones his dinner. The little ones his evening meal. The old among them he offers in sacrifice. The authors of Unaz's funerary texts were making an unambiguous declaration. The king's supremacy stemmed from his ability to absorb the divine powers through an act of spiritual consumption. His path to eternal life was unstoppable. He embodied dominion over all forces, earthly or celestial. This harsh assertion of authority over the gods also hinted at the king's attitude toward his human subjects. Although few historical records survive from Unaz's reign, and depictions of military conflict are scarce, one haunting sequence from the decorative reliefs along his pyramid's causeway suggests a chilling chapter of human suffering. These scenes, portraying famine in painful detail, resonate deeply with modern viewers familiar with similar images from humanitarian crises. In one scene, a frail man, close to death, is held upright by his gaunt wife and a concerned companion. In another, a starving woman resorts to eating lice from her own scalp. A young boy, his belly swollen from hunger, pleads for food. The depictions are agonizingly real, yet the individuals are anonymous. It is highly unlikely that these figures represented native Egyptians, given that funerary art was meant to project idealized perfection. The more plausible interpretation is that the starving people were desert-dwelling tribes, possibly the descendants of Egypt's earliest pastoral communities, who continued to survive in the barren lands flanking the Nile Valley. Their depiction served as a grim contrast to Egyptian prosperity and a stark warning to the king's subjects. Life outside the realm of Unaz's rule was one of suffering and despair. Despite the spiritual sophistication and ceremonial grandeur of the Fifth Dynasty, the authoritarian model of kingship never truly vanished.